Hello, everybody. I am so excited to be here with you tonight because we're going to talk about something very, very different. We're going to talk about a book that my sister wrote. Denise is here. Welcome, Denise D'Angelo Jones.
Thank you.
And it centers around the topic of German American immigrants in America, but mainly one specific family, which is our family. So we're going to talk about her book in a second, but I want to welcome all of you guys here, and just please do me a favor as we wait for you to show up. Let me know where you're from, and then also do me a favor and share this with your friends and family so that we can kind of, get something very lively here. We already have MC on here from Maryland, and she's talking to us about kind of her own personal history and family regarding, all of this German history. So I am Deanna from Hot for History. And I'm on YouTube and on Facebook and on all of the platforms. And mostly I talk about some kind of quirky history topics. And mainly my lives have been about the royal family. And so tonight we're doing sort of a little bit of a different change. And we're coming to you also on Facebook, which is something I normally don't do on my personal channel. And that is why we're asking you to share. But please do subscribe to Hot for History because it would make me very happy if you would. So tonight I am here with my sister, Denise, and we're going to discuss her number one listing Amazon book about Henry Zopf. It's called Henry's Children and Other Stories. And we're going to talk about this tonight. So I'm just going to give the bio, and then I'm going to kind of look to see what you guys have to say and where you're from. So Denise wait, let me do this so you guys can actually see her face a little bit better. Hi. Denise is my sister, and she's also a chiropractor, and she's a functional doctor, and she is a songwriter and kind of an expert on dementia care partnering. And she has written, she's a contributing writer, the Greensboro Herald, the Star Ledger, Today's Chiropractic. She's written many, many different articles and books, including in 2017, her sci-fi spiritual novel called Crystalina, The Pond of Awakening. And then she also wrote The Spanish Influenza, 19 Days in 1919, which is related to this topic that we're going to discuss tonight because it took place with the same family in the same location. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. And she worked on that while she was doing research at Oxford University. I had the great pleasure of visiting her there for her dementia communication book, which will be upcoming, called The Lady with the Purple Hat. So she's been guest lecturer at colleges, campuses. She is a great musician. She's very funny, and I'm so grateful for her to be putting all of this stuff together. So we want to welcome all of you. And Denise, I'm just going to say hey to like some of our friends here. We have Brian. He is from the UK, so he might know a little bit
Oh,
about
yeah.
Oxford. He's
Nice.
usually, when we talk about the royal family, sort of our UK connection. And then we also have Evelyn from Seattle, MC. I appreciate you guys so much for popping on, especially since I know this is not our usual content, but I wanted to cover it because it's special and it's unique. And so, Denise, I'm really happy to have you here. We are going to discuss. I want to kind of frame your chat a little bit. Like, I want to frame it right. Okay. So I'm just going to take the lead right now before I, have you speak and talk about German American history, because it's really interesting and it's very, very different, because a lot of people don't know about the German American history, but there's actually an area in the Midwest that's called something like the Midwest Triangle. And it's very interesting. So, and it's important to understand, especially because of this book. So I'm going to go back to, first off, the German American history goes way back into the 1700s, 1600s even. They came over with, in Jamestown and everything. In fact, there was a time in the 1700s when they were even considering printing the Declaration of Independence in German and having everything in German, because there were so many Germans here. But that didn't happen, although the Germans kept coming over. So I'm not going to read all of the history. I'm just going to start at 1880, which is sort of related to our topic. So in 1880, the decade, which that was the decade of the heaviest German immigration, with nearly 1.5 million Germans who left their country to settle in the United States. About 250,000, the greater number ever, arrived in 1882. Now, in 1890, 2.8 million German-born immigrants lived in the United States. A majority of the German-born living in the United States were located in what they call the German Triangle, which is where our family grew up in the Midwest, but that's also in Wisconsin, Cincinnati, and St. Louis. They were all looking for farmland. And then, sorry, guys, I'm just trying to cover this to give you context. About 800 German language journals were being printed in the United States in 1894. And then, and this was a huge number. By 1910, in that year, an estimated 2.3 million German-born immigrants lived in the United States. With the declining immigration, it was starting to slow down a little bit, and they were trying to assimilate into the country. And that number of German language publications, which, by the way, we're going to talk about a story in our own family regarding language and all of this. But anyhow, it started to decline to about 550. And then by 1920, there were only 200 journals. And then, of course, we know, like, by 1933, which was around the time that Hitler was kind of coming into his own, significant immigrations with very important, prominent German scientists, writers, musicians, scholars, and other artists and intellectuals wanted to get the heck out and go to the United States to escape persecution. And among them, I'll just name a few: Einstein, Bruno Walter, Walter Gropius, Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Oh, my German is bad. But anyhow, Marlene Dietrich, Kurt Weill, Billy Wilder. I mean, the whole 9 yards. So it's that context, guys, that Denise is here tonight, because we're going to discuss her book, which is called Henry's Children and Other Stories. And so with that background, I hope you don't mind, Denise, me rambling like that.
No.
I am going to ask you a question. Let's pull ourselves up onto the screen as far as, like, okay, so you wrote this book. Tell me why you wrote it, what inspired you to write it, and how it all came together, because there's many authors there too. So tell us the story.
Firstly, I never really planned on writing the story. Okay. So what happened was, and I never planned on writing the book before. I was writing my novel, and I was taking care of my mother, and my mother had dementia. She was walking in the middle of the night with sundowning. And I decided that rather than stopping her from what was coming up naturally for her, it was a process, that I would just write my book and we would just have a great time at 3:00 in the morning. So that's what we did. And I created a really great environment for her. Well, Mama, our mother, was an historian, and she was also a genealogist, and she had written several books on family history. So she ended up passing away in 2019, and then COVID came along, and I had a cousin that called me and my mother left me years and years and years, over 80 years of our Aunt Hilda's diaries. And so we had a cousin that called me and said, "Hey, COVID's happening now. What happened during the Spanish flu with our family? Do you have 1919 Hilda's diary?" I said, "Yeah." So I looked it up, and the story was so profound and even entertaining, how they coped through that I wrote the first book, Spanish Influenza 19 Days in 1919, to share with people.
That's
Well,
amazing.
People seem to like that, and they loved the family so much, because Hilda really talks about the day-to-day events that happened to the family, and they were funny people. They were so much fun. So the readers started falling in love with these characters, and I realized that we needed to have another book. And so a few years went by, and my mother had Henry's Children, which was written by my Aunt Hilda's sister, the same family. And I decided to write a story around that, because there were so many interesting stories about, number one, why did people come from Germany in the 1880s? What prompted our family, Henry Zopf, to come to America? What hardships did he face? What hardships did most of the Germans face in that area? How did they establish a new life for themselves and their families. So all of those questions are pretty much answered in the book and through the research I did, through the research my mother did. So I'm not any expert in history. My mother and DEANNA really are the history experts.
He was amazing. And then also there was, in addition to Hilda's diaries, there was a manuscript in existence with Claire, right? And so
Yes.
that is kind of how you got a hold of it. And I think the amazing thing to say, since you're talking about mom, was that yeah, that was where she spent her extra time. She wanted to do this genealogy, and most of it was before the internet. So she would put it in like spiral notebooks, or she would type it up, and like you could see the type wasn't like really computer type. And it was like, you know how you go to the like, like Staples and get things bound on their own. It was sort of like that. And so you took it and you kind of repurposed that book and you turned it into Henry's Children. So let's talk about who Henry was. So tell me first, because we're talking about immigration. So it's in the 18 somethings, and Henry is coming over to America, right? He left when he was 16. So what do you know about that part of the story?
Okay, so the book begins in Beikheim, Bavaria, where he was from. He was the youngest of 8 children. Only 5 survived, but he was the youngest, and many of his siblings were much older than him. And his father wanted his eldest son and youngest son to have a new life in a new country, the country of America. And they came here for economic opportunities and also for religious reasons, because at the time we had Otto von Bismarck, who was the ironclad chancellor of Germany at the time. And what he was doing was he wanted everyone to more or less become Protestant. And the southern region of Germany, of Bavaria, was usually ruled by the monarchy in the past. And it was very much strongly filled with Roman Catholics and the priests governed the schools there also. So what happened was that our grandfather wanted to leave that area and have greater economic opportunities, really, and to make money and raise a family and to be able to worship at the Lutheran church that he wanted to worship at.
Yeah, and they were farmers, which was the case, guys, for like all of the people, most of the people who came in. They wanted land, and then they wanted just the freedom to do that. He actually gave up his inheritance because he was the youngest, and in those days, the youngest son, I guess, would always get all of this land. So he had land there, but his mother somehow recognized that, hey, you need to leave. It was actually a very sweet love story. Her name was Rosina. And she was like, you have to go, because she was worried about him. She was worried about the future. And so he leaves. I think Denise weren't his brothers or something, or a brother, and some cousins and stuff were already over. And so what does he do? He comes over and he's like 16. He's like on Ellis Island. And then he goes on a train to the Midwest, and he had like they would give him, I think the mom gave him a cabbage, like for the train ride or something, or not the train ride, the boat ride, right?
His first trip was actually through Maryland, but then when he went back to visit, he went through Ellis
that's right. Yeah.
Island. But yeah, and so for a week, he just had cabbage to eat. But Henry was more, he had spent his summers, he was sneaking out of his house, which I write about, to spend time with the Romani Sinti. They would call them Zigeuner or gypsies, but Romani
oh my gosh,
Sinti
yes.
musicians. And these people loved family, and they were open with their affection, whereas German Americans or our great-grandfather didn't really show affection that much. And so he spent summers with these people, and they taught him how to really be free and to love the arts. And so his parents knew he wasn't really cut out to go into the military, because
he did love music.
He loved music so much, and he loved family so much. They thought he would have much better opportunities in America.
Right. That's I forgot about that part of the story, Denise. So, okay, we're going to talk about Mary and Henry and then talk about the kids. But I did have some comments. I have MC, who was the first one to comment. She said, good evening from Maryland. My German grandmother She was in the late 1800s. That's the same as Henry MC, in the US. And she didn't want to marry a German in upstate New York because Germans were looked down upon. There was a lot of discrimination against German Americans, which we'll get into slightly. But then she married in 1917, I guess, didn't she say an Irishman? Hold on. She married a man a few years older than her with Irish descent. Yeah. Exactly. And there's some people here that are so awesome. They're saying they love this type of thing, Denise. And,
Oh, I'm
I
so
mean,
glad,
it
y'all.
can seem academic and boring for some people, but I think it's, when I think of the book, honestly, I think I describe it as, I think, somebody said the Waltons, but it's sort of, I say it's like Little Women if there were 7 girls and 2 boys. So Henry comes to America. And he's there. We don't need to get into the entire story because you guys can read it. I have the link, by the way, in the description. But he comes to America and he meets our great grandmother, who, because Henry's our great grandfather, Mary, at a cigar shop. And she's German too, because her family had come over years prior. And she was born in this town called Mendota, which was all German. And we're going to talk a little bit about that too, right? So what was the deal with her parents and grandparents?
So what happened was that with Mary, it's really an interesting story. So her mother's mother came over right around the time a little before Henry came over, and she was a midwife, and she came over and she bought one of the oldest houses in Mendota, Illinois, and she birthed a lot of babies. Okay, so her daughter was Mary's mother. Now, Mary's mother married a man who was a farmer, John Langlitz. And the thing is he was kind of protective of his daughters, and he had back problems and was really having trouble physically farming after a while. So he wanted to make sure that his daughters married people that were successful and that could help out, around the farm, or to help out financially, I think is what was happening. He didn't want to let her go. He didn't want to let her go, but our grandfather was able to talk to him and talk him into it.
Yeah, and he ended up turning into a successful businessman with a bakery. Okay, so let's talk about the kids. There were 9 kids, and I'd love for you to tell some of the stories. A lot of the book was written by two of the children. Hilda, which is basically it's her diaries for the Spanish influenza book that you have, that also we have a link in here. And then it was Claire. And so just give us 2 or 3 stories of the kids, because this is the part that gets me every time. And it's so fun to read, is what was going on in that house in the early 1900s.
Well, Hilda was the oldest, okay, and she really stayed home and took care of the kids and everything, but she had an incredible sense of humor. And she had all these young sisters and brothers, and I just want to do an aside before I get into the story. The first book has actual diary entries. This book doesn't have diary entries. It's more of both of the sisters telling stories, like the stories that Deanna and I learned when we were kids. But one story, when the children became older, when they were old enough to have slumber parties, I love the story where Aunt Hilda loved to pull pranks. So what they would do is they would go out dancing, and dancing was a huge deal in the 20s, of course, in 30s and 40s. And they would go to Puritan Park and they would go dancing. And then at a certain time of night, because the lights were gas lights, they were shut off. So picture yourself walking down the street at midnight or 1 a.m. with absolutely no lights. So it was very, very dark. And they were about 2 blocks away from where all the bars were, because they were right by Main Street.
Oh boy.
So all these girls are coming in, and they had all these tents in the backyard. And so Hilda decided to pull a prank on them, where she wanted to take like a kind of like a scarecrow kind of character, like a bunch of hay, and put like a head that looked like someone's head with a hat on it, and put it in. It wasn't really a sleeping bag, but they're, wherever they were sleeping. And then she took vodka and she poured it all over. So when the girls walked into the tent at night, it was really dark, and all they saw was it looked like a man sleeping, and they could smell alcohol, and they all screamed and woke up half the neighbors and ran out of the tent.
That's so funny. And they were probably sleeping in tents because at night it would get hot, and why not sleep in a tent? And of course they were having a slumber party. So
yeah.
There's also a story, I think, about like some kind of parade, like circus or something in Mendota. at
It
the
was a
time?
it was a really, really big deal when the circus would come to town, and the train would be right there, and then they would take all of the circus animals and all of the acrobatic people and the clowns and everything, and in order to get people to go out to the fairgrounds and to have an interest in the circus, and they did this all over the Midwest, really, they would take elephants, and they would take the elephants, and they would have this huge circus parade, and so they would, march everyone out to the fairgrounds. The only problem is that they would take some side streets sometimes, and the elephants would just stray. And the elephants would end up in people's yards and scaring people. And of course, they would kind of do their business. And then Hilda was saying that they would take these switches and try to like move the elephants. The elephants would just kind of do their own thing. And it was interesting for children from the Midwest seeing an elephant up front in their yard.
Yeah.
It's just quite an
I
interesting.
mean, of note, they did have things like cows and chickens already in their yards during
Yes.
that time. But and just to give you guys context, we were talking about Hilda. She was born in the late eight. We're not clear if it was 1898 or 1899. There
99.
seems to be some debate, but probably, but then, so this is the early 1900s. I think the last child, the ninth one, was born in 1910 or 12. I can't remember.
Oh.
Yeah, and so that's the time frame. But Denise, let's just look at some of these pictures. Like this is the dining room, and
Yes.
it's Hilda's here on the end, and then there are twins, Carol and Kathy, that are sitting on the laps, and then this is Claire, who contributed to this book, and then we've got a couple of the other kids, and then this was a cousin, I think, and then this was an
Emil.
aunt, correct?
Yeah, Aunt Lizzie and Emil Bauer. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So
And Hilda on the right.
the town, it's important to kind of mention these things. The town to this day is, a little side piece. These small towns, so this town is like 7,000 people. If you like, we have a list of like how everybody's kind of related. They're still kind of related. Like there's so many people that are related because my great grandfather came over with two other guys that were like teenagers. And then they married from a family of like 9 kids, another like 7, 8 kids, which was our other family, which was my grandmother who had sisters. And so then they married, and then other people married. And so it was like all these Germans were marrying, and they were like in that town, there were Irish, all kinds of people from all over Europe. Yeah. All over. And down the road, there was this mine disaster that I wrote about and I did a video on, where there were a lot of Italian immigrants. So, it was very common to sort of have this Euro flair, and they were allowed to speak their language. It was like the wild, wild West. Okay, so let me see. Yeah, my 5 kids would have been a joke back then. You had kids back in those. You did, Evelyn. They would all have many children. And then, as we were mentioning, our great grandmother was, a midwife in the town. So she was, yeah. And by the way, these pictures that you see, let me see. These pictures that you see, these are our relatives. It was for those of you who've been following my YouTube channel, especially, I do tell stories of the family and the house, and there's a dark room in their basement where they would develop their own photos, which is also very rare. Like they were very creative, artsy, I would say high tech, even though today it seems funny to say that, but they were really into new technology. And so they were taking these pictures, posing for these scenes. Some of them, they're trying to make it look like they were, just regular scenes, and they weren't necessarily. So one story I do want to tell was we briefly touched upon the language. So if you notice from the very beginning of this video, I talk about how there used to be 800 publications in America, then there were 500, then there were 230. Well, they were trying to basically get rid of I don't know what it's called, but it's called like cultural appropriation or something like that. They're trying to really kind of make them Americans. And yet this family and many like them spoke their language almost exclusively. The church down the street was German. And so they had an English speaking they had an English speaking service too, but they would go through their communion. They would go through their confirmation. They would go through their wedding ceremonies. Everything was in German. They went to school and they were speaking German. So that's the story. When our grandmother and her sisters and brothers were going to the school, and Henry and Mary get a knock on the door, and they're like, "Excuse me, Mr. Zopf and Mrs. Zopf," it was the teacher. "You have to tell your kids that they can't speak German anymore in school. They have to speak English, and you better start speaking English here, because they're not allowed to, they're not going to be successful if they don't. Like, if they don't start speaking English, like, they're going to, so she was trying to do what she thought was best, but basically this was an obedient family. And it was during the time when, there was some German discrimination. Actually, this family not only this family, but like the Midwest Germans oftentimes were discriminated against in big ways, especially as the war, as years went by, World War I, World War II, it got bad. It got really, really bad. So they tried to hide their Germanness. So they stopped speaking German. And we have these stories of when my great grandfather was passing away, of him speaking the 23rd Psalm in German. And it was the same way with our grandmother, who had stopped when she was like a little kid. When she was passing away, she kept speaking in German. So the language thing was, they wanted everybody to assimilate to English, even though technically, and even to this day, there's no official required language. We think there is, but there really isn't. So that was the deal that was what they were dealing with. So in the meantime, I wanted to talk about the town a little bit. And Denise, I'm just really excited about this book, because I'm excited to be able to have this for my kids too, that they can read about their family, because we are, if you count the generations from that town, like 6th generation for that town, because it would be our great 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 grandmother, our great great grandmother, our great grandmother, our grandmother, our mother, and then there's us. So it's just a lot. So meaning if it's your family, so I'm sure you, she's saying, I bet you see yourselves in some of these photos. Evelyn, that's so sweet for you to like think that. I do. Like I look sometimes and I'm like, oh, that, and yeah, I mean, I think Denise and I, and Denise, you can talk about this. Like, we grew up surrounded by tons of photos, tons of verbal stories, which is how people would spread information years ago. And then we had it written in diaries. So we thought that was normal, right?
Absolutely. And our Aunt Hilda, whenever anyone would have a question about something that happened 40 years ago, she would leave the room. And I didn't know at the time that she had her diaries hidden under lock and key in a closet under the stairs. And so then she would come back, no, that happened at 2:00, such and such. She recorded everything, y'all. She recorded the weather patterns. We talk about global warming now. Let me tell you something. In 1920, in January of 1920, they had episodes where it should have been freezing, where it was really warm outside in
Wow.
February. So it was interesting. It's interesting to look back at these. Yeah.
Yeah, it is true. Like, the diaries, first off, they write really small, and they'll say things like, we had blueberry pie today. And it's always the blueberries that they picked from like outside or something, and they would eat. Like, they would have, like, every meal had dessert.
They would have full meals on china, and then they would hand wash their dishes, and the ironing that they would do, and they didn't have vacuum cleaners. They would be sweeping everything, washing windows. It was amazing. It was
Yeah,
amazing how much housework
it,
they did.
it was a lot.
It was a lot.
So I think some of you know, but I'm going to tell the story. So Denise and I, this is the house. So the story, I'm going to get into the story of the house a little bit. The town is Mendota. I'm just showing this picture so you can see, this isn't totally our family. I think we've got some extras here.
Yes,
but the town is called Mendota, and there's 7,000 people that were living there. But it was during the time in Illinois, the Central Valley of Illinois, sort of like a major hub, because there was a train there, and people would come through, and my great grandfather had a bakery, so they'd get bread. Like, it was like the center of so much. And so the descriptions in these diaries, especially with Spanish influenza, with Hilda's diaries, are so interesting because there's things that you don't think about. And then with this book as well. So, there's talk about this town, but the town comes alive in these books, at least the history. And here's some of these the people. I think they may have been, I don't know, just getting together for something. But this is Claire on the right. Wait, oh, you're not seeing it. Sorry.
Oh.
This is Claire on the right.
That's Claire. That's for sure.
And she was a character. I did a short video on her, guys. I call her the Flapper because she hung around with some very interesting people in the 1920s. She would get dropped off at the house, in a big car by a guy named Gumdrop. I mean,
Gumdrops, yes.
Who knows what the deal was there, but she contributed. And then my mother, I just so appreciate you guys to let me tell, kind of more of this personal story. So my mother on the left, Shirley, and then Kent, also Denise put some of their writings into this book, which was so thoughtful and great. They were grandchildren of Henry. My mother was, one of the first grandchildren. And then Kent unfortunately passed away at the age of 35. And his mom, Marie, my grandmother's sister, had him when she was like 42 years old. So their writings are in the book, which is amazing. And then there's our writing, we're writing as well. So back to this house briefly, because you guys don't all know, my mother had to sell this house, which was the house where all of these people grew up in. Like there were 9, they bought this house. It was really special. It was very fancy during the time. So they bought the house. And then in the year 2000, my mother had to sell the house. My mother died in 2019, never getting to be back in her family home. It was her grandparents. So in 2020, after my mother had passed away, Denise and I showed up at the house, said a little prayer, and we were just like, we just want a picture in front of the house because we had so many great memories and we had all this material about the house. And then 2 weeks later, the house became available for sale.
Yes.
And I ended up buying the house 9 months after that, on the 1-year anniversary of my mother passing away. Simultaneously, we had, I don't ever like to say the word, but we had the big pandemic, right? And so that was the context in which I bought the house. But then Denise brought out these diaries. So mention a little bit about the book, The Spanish Influenza. I know you already did, but let's talk about it a little bit.
So this is the personal experience that this family of 11 had. All of them lived through it. This is before anyone had anything they would take. They didn't separate people. And basically, everyone just had herd immunity at that time. And if they had symptoms, they would stay in their own homes and they would hire a nurse. So then it's the story of the nurse that came, who was an amazing woman, and then the doctor that would come and visit. And it's just interesting because Hilda captured even the dialogue that they said. It reads like a play. So when I read that, I said, I've got to make a book out of this and share it with people, because it gave a lot of hope to people at the time. If you remember, there were a lot of people that were living in fear. However anyone looked at the experience of the pandemic that we had. And so I just felt as though this story would give them hope, because everyone survived and did very, very well in life. And they all lived to be octogenarians except one.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, they did. And yet they would tell stories about the mass amounts of people that were dying. Like they would
that's true.
They would look out the door and see like the hearses going by. And if you go into the cemetery, there's so many people that passed away. But the doctor there, you could write an entire book, Denise, about E.P. Cook, the actual doctor who was like a miracle man in the way that he treated his family.
It was incredibly emotional for me, because the doctor, he appears in the book, because there are only 19 pages that I put in here. Well, then I thought to myself, I was reading in my mother's genealogy book, or anyway, I found out that he died about 5 years after that. He died in 1923. I thought he wasn't that old. Well, I looked everywhere I could think of to look on all the different sites. There was no mention of what caused him to die. And then I thought, oh, I've got Hilda's diaries. So I went to 1923, the year that he died, and there's an entire detailed account of what happened to him. He died saving the life of a farmer by giving him surgery, and he became infected. But it is a detailed account, so I put that in the book, and it's a great read.
That's amazing.
Great
So,
read. He
in
was a
other words,
wonderful man. Wonderful
you
man.
couldn't Google what the life of this man was. He didn't end up having any children because I think one of his only child passed away or something, right?
Yes. And then Hilda put in the diary, and I didn't put this. I wish I would have. I don't think I did put it in there. But that he died a year after his wife and child died from the influenza. And then he wanted to be buried with her picture. So then when they went to the funeral, it showed him in the casket with her picture on his chest. So then Deanna and I went out to, and we were walking around, it was called Westland Cemetery, and we stumbled upon his grave. And it was so emotional for me. I just got so
Yeah.
choked up seeing his grave because I have such a personal connection to him and the other people I've read about in the diary. Amazing
Yeah.
people from Mendota and their ancestors. So many people that live in Mendota today love history, and they're very well read in family history. And it's just a great town. It's a great town.
And I think, I have a big heart for revitalizing, rebuilding these old towns in the Midwest. There is a campaign called Reimagine Mendota that they're working on that. But it's not just this town. It's many towns that have just the rich history that people just don't know about, and they just kind of drive through them. But anyhow, I am so grateful, Denise, that you were here. I also appreciate everybody who stayed on. I know this is not my regular content. I will definitely come back with some more material on the royal family or whatever, but I really felt like I wanted to talk about this. The book is called Henry's Children. Let me see if I can get back.
And other stories.
And other stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it's at Amazon right now. The link for the book is in my in the description here. And you can definitely go ahead and order it. Also want to make mention, I've started Ancestry and learned so much. Yeah. And so we're getting some questions here, as this always happens when I try to
That's
go
okay.
off, but I always want to, I always want to take the questions or comments. But anyhow, this book is amazing in that sense. And just to think, I mean, I wouldn't have started Hot for History. I would not have started Hot for History had I not made the leap to buy the house back. And I don't know. I was thinking about it today, Denise. I was like, would she have done all these books had we not bought the house? I don't know. Maybe you would have, but I don't know if it would have had the same significance had we not revisited the home. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
So,
I don't know. I don't know.
yeah, we don't know. So having the house back and all of this brought me here. And for Denise and I, like, media, it has always been our specialty. Like, I've always been in the arts and music, and so is Denise. And so this leap of faith, and for me, it was buying the house, but she definitely encouraged me. And for her, it was really kicking off and publishing these diaries, because our mother said, I don't know if we mentioned that, but I know that one of the things that she said was she doesn't know if anybody would remember her 100 years from now, but she also said this when she gave me the genealogy, and then she gave you, the other stuff to hang on to. What did she say?
She said when the diaries came in the mail in 2010, she said, something about, I know someday one of you will do something with this, because she knows Deanna. Deanna already had a book published. She's the writer of the family, really. And then she knew that one of us would do something with this, but she always knew that I was always wanting to write.
Yeah.
And my interest is in screenwriting. So making movies out of this.
Yeah.
And I want to say something real quick, and I know we don't have much time, but
it's fine.
I want to thank all of you for staying on and listening. And those of you who look at this later that have an interest in family history, I just want to say that if I can put this together of some of the diaries that I have, so can you if you're interested in it. And I just want to encourage you to dive into the history if you have that longing, because what you will find out is you'll learn so much about yourself. And so I just think it's a great thing for all of us to do. And I'm just so grateful that, you're interested to stay here and listen to this and to read
Yeah.
the books. I really want to thank you for that.
Yeah, that's so sweet and so true, Denise, because like genealogy is so great and so special. And yeah, it's amazing. And I'm grateful that my mom started out, like, it's a great example. If you just have something on your heart, then just go do it, even if it's very simple, because you don't know if the next generation or the generation after will do it. I'm working on a book about the house, which I'm calling Denise all the time. Hey, can you look, like, I'm asking her, history questions. So I'm working on that as well. But we thank you.
Thank
If
you
you
so
want to
much.
come to Germany
Thank you.
with me, next year, I'm going on a tour of Germany, Austria, and Vienna. And the description is the information's in the description. I thank you. And Denise, I'm so proud of you going number
Thank you.
one.
Thank you. Thank you so
What an
much.
exciting day it's been. And thank you, everybody, for staying on and just for all of your support. So we will talk to you later. Thank you,
Thank you
everybody.
so much. Thank all of you, really. Thank
Yeah,
you, Deanna.
and goodbye.